Most people trust Aristotle without even noticing it, not because they have studied him deeply, but because the way they think already carries his fingerprints. The habit of classifying things, defining them, breaking life into categories that can be understood, explained, and organized. It feels natural. It feels like clarity. And in many ways, it works. Aristotle gives you a way to make sense of the world. He tells you that everything has a purpose, a function, a role it is meant to fulfill. A knife is good if it cuts well. A human life is good if it fulfills its function well. And from that, he builds one of the most influential ideas in all of philosophy, that the goal of life is to become what you are meant to be at your highest level, to reach excellence through reason, through balance, through discipline. It sounds solid. It sounds almost undeniable. But this is exactly where the problem begins, because the moment you accept that framework fully, you start to see your life as something that needs to be optimized toward a fixed idea of what it should be. You stop asking what you actually are in motion and start asking what you are supposed to become. And those two are not the same. Aristotle's thinking depends on the idea that there is a stable structure underneath everything, that human nature has a kind of built-in direction, and that the good life is about aligning yourself with that direction as accurately as possible. That is why he talks about virtue as a kind of balance, a mean between extremes, something you can train, refine, and gradually perfect. Again, there's something real in this. Discipline matters. Habits matter. Learning how to act well in different situations matters. No serious thinker would deny that. But the issue is not with the usefulness of these ideas. The issue is with how complete they claim to be. Because once you start believing that there is a correct form of life that you are supposed to approximate, something subtle happens to the way you experience yourself. You begin to treat your life like a project, something to shape, correct, improve, and bring closer to an ideal. You measure your actions against standards, your character against virtues, your choices against what a rational and well-formed person would do. And at first, that can feel empowering. It gives you direction. It gives you structure. It makes you feel like you're not drifting, like you're building something intentional. But over time, it can create a kind of tension that is difficult to name, because you're no longer just living. You're constantly adjusting. There's always a sense that you could respond better, act better, think better, that there's a more correct version of yourself, just slightly ahead of where you are. And that distance, even if it is small, never fully disappears. You improve, but the standard improves with you. So you remain in motion, always refining, always calibrating, but rarely arriving at a point that feels complete. This is where Aristotle's system begins to show its limits, because it treats human life as something that can be shaped into a stable form, something that can be aligned with reason in a consistent way. But real life is not stable like that. It changes. It interrupts itself. It presents situations that do not fit neatly into balanced responses or well-trained habits. And more importantly, you're not stable either. You're not a fixed thing moving toward a final shape. You're constantly shifting. Your values change. Your understanding deepens. Your priorities move, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. What felt right at one point can feel incomplete later. What once seemed like a virtue can start to feel like a limitation in a different context. But if you are operating inside a framework that assumes a stable human nature with a clear direction, these changes become difficult to integrate. They start to feel like deviations, like you're moving away from what you are supposed to be, instead of recognizing that what you are is not something fixed in the first place. This is the quiet pressure that builds inside Aristotle's system. It encourages growth, but within boundaries that are more rigid than they appear. You are allowed to improve, but towards something already defined. You are allowed to develop, but within a structure that assumes it already knows what development looks like. And that creates a subtle conflict, because part of you is following the structure, trying to become more balanced, more rational, more aligned with virtue. And another part of you is changing in ways that do not always fit neatly into that structure. And when those two parts don't match, you begin to question yourself, not the framework. You assume the system is correct, so if something doesn't fit, the problem must be you. You're not disciplined enough, not consistent enough, not clear enough. So you try harder. You refine more. You adjust again. But the tension remains because the issue is not that you are failing to match the system. The issue is that the system does not fully account for what you are. Aristotle's way of thinking is incredibly powerful for understanding patterns, for building habits, for creating a sense of direction. But it also carries a hidden assumption that human life can be understood as something that has a correct form. And once that assumption settles in, you begin to live as if your task is to discover and conform to that form, instead of recognizing that your life might not have a single fixed shape at all, that it might be something that unfolds, contradicts itself, changes direction, and cannot always be reduced to balance or rational consistency. And this is where the idea starts to become misleading, not because it is obviously wrong, but because it is too clean for something that is not. Once you start living inside that framework, it begins to shape not just how you act, but how you judge everything, including yourself in moments where life does not behave the way the system expects it to. You begin to measure your responses. Was that the right amount of anger or too much? Was that restraint or avoidance? Was that courage or recklessness? At first, this kind of reflection feels useful. It sharpens you. It helps you see patterns in your behavior. It gives you language to understand what you are doing. But slowly, it turns into something else. It becomes constant. You're no longer just responding to life. You are evaluating your response while it is happening, and even after it is over, you revisit it, replay it, adjust it in your mind as if you could have aligned it better with some ideal balance. And this creates a strange split inside you. There's the part of you that is living, reacting, feeling, moving through situations in real time. And then there's the part of you that is watching, comparing, correcting, trying to bring everything back toward what it thinks is the right form. That second layer does not disappear. It becomes your default. And when that happens, spontaneity starts to shrink. Not completely, but enough that you notice something is different. You hesitate more. You think before you feel. You adjust before you act. Again, this can look like maturity, like control, like refinement. But it can also mean that you are no longer fully inside your own experience. You are managing it. This is where Aristotle's idea of balance begins to create an unexpected kind of pressure. Because balance sounds simple in theory, but in practice, it is incredibly difficult to locate. What is the exact middle between too much and too little? How much confidence is right before it becomes arrogance? How much caution is right before it becomes fear? How much honesty is right before it becomes harm? There is no fixed answer. The context changes everything. But the framework still pushes you to believe that there is a correct point you should be hitting, a precise alignment that defines whether your response is virtuous or not. And that belief makes you search for precision in situations that are inherently messy. You start trying to calculate what cannot be calculated. And when you cannot find that perfect balance, you feel slightly off, slightly misaligned, even if what you did was completely human and reasonable given the situation. This is where the system begins to feel heavier. Because instead of helping you navigate life, it starts setting a standard that you're constantly trying to meet but can never fully confirm. You don't know if you are exactly in the right place. You can only approximate it, guess it, adjust toward it. So there's always a quiet uncertainty underneath your actions. Not loud enough to stop you, but present enough to keep you from feeling fully settled in what you do. And this uncertainty feeds into something deeper. It makes you rely more on the framework itself. You begin to trust the system more than your immediate sense of what feels right in a situation. If something feels intense, you pull it back. If something feels uncertain, you try to stabilize it. If something does not fit into the categories you understand, you try to reshape it so it does. And over time, your relationship with yourself changes. Instead of listening directly to what you feel and then thinking through it, you begin filtering your experience through structure first. You check whether it fits, whether it aligns, whether it is balanced. And if it does not, you adjust it. Not always consciously, but consistently. This is how a useful tool turns into a quiet limitation. Because life does not always move in balanced lines. Sometimes it demands excess. Sometimes it requires you to go too far in one direction in order to break out of something that has held you back. Sometimes clarity comes from intensity, not moderation. Sometimes growth comes from imbalance, not for staying centered. But if you're deeply shaped by the idea that virtue always sits in the middle, you become hesitant to explore those extremes, even when they are necessary. You stay within a safe range. You avoid going too far, even when going too far might be exactly what the situation requires. And that safety can look like wisdom, but it can also be a form of limitation. You never fully test the edges of who you are, because you're always trying to remain within what is considered appropriate, rational, balanced. And over time, that can flatten your experience. Not dramatically, not in a way that feels like something is broken, but in a way that makes everything slightly more controlled, slightly more measured, slightly less alive. You're still moving forward, but within boundaries you did not fully choose. This is where the idea that Aristotle got something wrong starts to become clearer. It is not that balance has no value. It is that treating balance as the central answer to human life ignores the fact that life itself is not centered. It moves, shifts, disrupts, contradicts. And sometimes, the most meaningful moments in life do not happen in the middle. They happen when you step outside of it. And this is where the whole picture needs to come together, because the real issue is not that Aristotle gave people a bad way to live. It is that he gave a way of living that feels complete, even when it leaves something essential out. His system works best when life is stable enough to be shaped. When your environment is predictable, when your goals are clear, when your identity feels relatively fixed, then ideas like balance, discipline, and rational alignment can guide you in a powerful way. They help you build consistency. They help you avoid extremes that can damage you. They help you become reliable in your own actions. But life does not stay in that kind of condition. It breaks patterns. It forces you into situations that don't match your preparation, where there is no clear middle, no obvious balance, no time to calculate what the right response should be. And in those moments, something deeper than a framework is required. You're not choosing between too much and too little. You're trying to respond to something that has no clear measure. This is where Aristotle's structure begins to feel insufficient. Not because it is weak, but because it assumes a level of stability that real life cannot guarantee. It assumes that you can shape yourself toward a steady form. But there are moments when you're not shaping yourself. You're being reshaped by loss, by change, by pressure, by experiences that interrupt everything you thought you understood about yourself. And in those moments, the idea that you should remain balanced can feel almost disconnected from what is actually happening. Sometimes balance is not what you need. Sometimes you need to go through something fully, to feel it without immediately trying to regulate it, to respond in a way that is not measured but real, to allow a certain kind of intensity that does not fit into a clean category of virtue. And this is where something important becomes clear. Human life is not just something you refine. It is something you encounter. And encounters are not always balanced. They can be uneven, overwhelming, unclear. They can push you in directions that do not make sense at the time. They can force you to act before you fully understand what you're doing. And in those moments, your response is not guided by a stable idea of the right measure. It is guided by something more immediate, something that cannot always be explained in terms of reason or moderation. This does not mean abandoning thought. It means recognizing that thought is not always ahead of experience. Sometimes it follows it. Sometimes you understand what you did only after you have already done it. Sometimes you recognize what mattered only after you have already felt it. And that kind of understanding does not come from applying a framework in advance. It comes from living through something that the framework could not fully contain. This is the part that Aristotle's system struggles with. It is designed to guide action, but not always to account for transformation. It helps you become a certain kind of person, but it has difficulty explaining what happens when you no longer fit into that shape. When your values shift, when your priorities change, when the person you were trying to become no longer feels like the person you need to be. And this happens more often than people expect. Not in dramatic ways every time, but in gradual shifts that accumulate. You start questioning what you once accepted. You start feeling that something is missing, not because you lack discipline or clarity, but because the structure you are following no longer matches the direction you are moving in. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can try to force yourself back into alignment with the system, or you can allow yourself to move beyond it. The first option feels safer. It keeps things consistent. It gives you a sense of control. It allows you to continue refining what you already understand, but it can also keep you contained. The second option is less clear. It means stepping into something that is not fully defined. It means letting go of the idea that there is a single correct form of life you are supposed to achieve. It means accepting that your path may not look balanced in the way you were taught to value. And that is uncomfortable because it removes certainty, but also opens something else. A different kind of relationship with your life. One where you're not constantly trying to measure yourself against an ideal, but are instead paying attention to what is actually happening, what is changing, what is emerging. In that space, balance does not disappear, but it stops being the goal. It becomes something that appears when it is needed and disappears when it is not. Sometimes you are centered, sometimes you are not, and neither state defines you completely. This is a more flexible way of living, but also a more demanding one, because it does not give you a fixed answer. It asks you to stay aware, to recognize when structure is helping you and when it is limiting you, to see when discipline is guiding you and when it is holding you back, to understand that becoming a certain kind of person is not the end of the process. It is just one phase of it. Aristotle gave people a powerful way to shape themselves, but he also gave them a picture that can become too narrow if it is taken as the final truth. Because you're not just something that needs to be shaped into balance. You're something that changes, that moves, that sometimes breaks its own structure in order to become something else. And that cannot always be explained in terms of moderation or rational perfection. It has to be lived. That is where the limitation shows. Not in what Aristotle saw, but in what his system cannot fully hold. And once you see that, you don't have to reject him. But you also don't have to stay inside his framework, as if it is the only way to understand what your life is supposed to be.